Hello and welcome to Tomorrow is the Question, the podcast where we explore what we need to do today for a fully human tomorrow. I'm Jono Baggaley, editor of Fully Human, and in this episode we're going to be introducing an unexpected source of rich material for exploring sex, relationships, misogyny, gender norms, and more with children and young people. We could call it teaching by bad example, and in fact, when I first discussed using this material with Dr. Elly Hanson, I was a little sceptical. But by the end of the conversation you're about to hear, I was completely won over. We're talking about a figure from 20th century fiction and film who's been described as an icon of adventure, a guru of male style and an emblem of glamour, but is also a champion of consumerism and a loaded figure of sex and violence. He's a character almost everyone will have encountered in some form, as his films are amongst the few laden with sex and violence that families might sit down together to watch at Christmas. And it is this fact that everyone from teenagers to grandparents will have a view that makes this figure so useful and unique in British popular culture. Of course, I'm talking about James Bond. And who better to discuss this with than Dr. Ian Kinane, editor of the International Journal of James Bond Studies and Bond expert, alongside Dr. Weston, founder of Tooled Up Education, who's been using Bond to stimulate conversations with families around the dinner table. And Fully Human's Dr. Elly Hanson, who is working with Ian and Kathy to develop educational resources using Bond as source material. I found it a really thought-provoking conversation in which we discuss Bond as symbol of masculinity and Britishness, his problematic approach to sex and relationships, and how on earth he manages to fight bad guys with a blood alcohol level which would kill a man twice his size. Finally, of course, we answer the only question which really matters. Who is the next Bond? Stay tuned to find out. Welcome to this Fully Human conversation. I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Kathy Weston, who is a criminologist and the founder of Tooled Up Education. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you.
And Dr. Ian Kinane, who is an associate professor at Roehampton University and also the editor of the International Journal of James Bond Studies. Delighted to have you here, Ian.
Hi, Jono. Thanks for having us.
And finally, last but not least, Dr. Elly Hanson, Fully Human's own research lead. Welcome back, Elly.
Great to be here.
So, we are here to talk about James Bond. Now, in the last episode of Tomorrow is the Question, we did a deep dive exploration into online misogyny. And so, in many senses, this kind of, we can pick up on some of those conversations because if you see James Bond to some extent, arguably an archetypal figure in presentations of misogyny throughout the 20th century and the early 21st, but also a figure through whom we can explore gender norms, relationships, digital literacy, and much more beyond. So I'm really excited to be kicking off this conversation. So I'm going to start with you, Ian, and just to really get a sense of who are we talking about when we're talking about James Bond, or perhaps what are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start where I tend to like starting with this kind of question. Bond is an orphan. Bond is sent to private school at the behest of his carer. And I don't think that's inextricable to who he becomes, let's say, or his function politically in certainly Britain and in world politics. He was created by Ian Fleming, himself privately educated, went to Eton College. There's a tendency, it seems, to read Bond as Fleming, Fleming as Bond, or to sort of see them as the same person. That's not necessarily the case. We don't ever do that with other authors, but certainly Fleming had something of a kind of reputation that we might recognise from Bond on screen. There's a sense here of his being a kind of blunt instrument, an object, a tool that is weaponised largely against sort of wider world politics, right? This is a kind of a lapdog of British interests who is often sent out to foreign climes to, in effect, control the world, or to bring it under the control, let's say, of, at the time that Fleming was writing in the early 1950s through to the early 1960s, a kind of waning British power. So this is a sort of a symbol, a figurehead of a certain kind of Britishness. And again, I think this is something we can probably delve into a bit more as we talk about the kind of the changing notion of what Britishness is. Bond himself, we might think of as a kind of an icon of national masculinity. What I mean by that is, we've had at this stage 6 different actors, not all of whom, I should say, are in fact British. The majority of them are not in fact British. So the notion of the kind of the British national body is called into question, even in the casting in the films. But this sense of him being or representing a kind of homogenized vision of what British masculinity is or should look like. Now, even if we think of the kind of different actors who've played them over the years, starting famously with Sean Connery, then on to George Lazenby for his one film, back to Connery for one film, Roger Moore did 7, Timothy Dalton did 2, Pierce Brosnan did 4, and Daniel Craig did 5. Even just, those names connote a certain kind of physicality. We can get a sense of what that body looks like and how it changes from the kind of the early 1960s when we started with Connery to the sort of buff, rough and tumble of Daniel Craig. That's a body that's worked out. So when we talk about Bond as being a kind of a representative of a certain kind of maybe what Thomas Hughes might have called muscular Christianity, the idea of playing out a certain moral, spiritual cleanliness, the idea being that, okay, Bond's body is the perfected ideal, not just of British mores, British morals, but also of a kind of sort of ethical, moral, political superiority. Bond's body is greater often than the villains' bodies, which are often scarred or in some ways deformed. There's a sense of him being wrapped up in a kind of national politic as well. A lot of people will probably recognise the heyday of sort of British culture, 2012, the Olympics, the Queen's Jubilee, Daniel Craig, well, not actually Daniel Craig, but a stunt double for Daniel Craig jumping out of a helicopter over the Olympics ceremony with a kind of, again, the Queen's stunt double. So this alignment in our culture of Bond, Britishness, a certain kind of conservative lapdog, a certain kind of conservative politics, what is Britishness? And again, I imagine this is something we can probably talk a bit more about going forward.
So not only representing masculinity, but a very specific way in which masculinity then represents something to do with the nation.
Absolutely. There's a certain sort of tie between Bond as a sort of entity and Britain as a sort of larger political entity. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the time at which Fleming is writing, we have, let's say, Anthony Eden, the former Prime Minister, the sort of shame of the Suez Canal crisis and the sort of, I suppose, the deformation of British Empire from the kind of post-war period onwards. You have this sort of concomitant rise of Bond as a sort of an icon that steps in or is in some ways replacing a Britain that was seen to be waning in its world and its sort of global power. So I think there's absolutely a kind of a sort of an overlap between what we see as a sort of the real world decline of British values, Britain in the post-war period, and the sort of projection onto a British identity of all the things that Bond means, both in this country, in Britain, and globally as well.
That's so interesting. I mean, it's also kind of represents that shift from the hard power of imperialism into sort of soft power and kind of cultural projection. But as I'm sure we'll explore further, ultimately that being a projection which is fundamentally quite problematic. I mean, I think just on this, Elly, heard a bit from Ian about kind of Bond's roots, if we take him as a sort of human figure. What does some of that, do you think, might mean for the type of figure that he becomes and the type of man he becomes and represents?
Well, I think in many ways, Bond is actually a very accurate portrayal of a certain trajectory on from what we might call toxic vulnerability. What I mean by that is, experiences of vulnerability as a child where you weren't met with care, that were overwhelming, and one path on from those is to develop a bit of a shell, a hard exterior, and to avoid experiences of vulnerability in one's adult life. So, Bond is an orphan. Bond went to boarding school at a young age. Again, we see some mirror of some of these things in Fleming's own life. And, British culture, particularly at that kind of elite level, in inverted commas, was encouraging a way of dealing with vulnerability, which is to, have the stiff upper lip and therefore don't become vulnerable. And it's really, what's really interesting is that Bond is then kind of characterised within the novels and films as a real man. And this is the theme that no doubt Ian can talk more about. And I think what's really interesting to look at is, okay, so, what can this real man do? What are his strengths? What are his capabilities? But also, if he has taken that trajectory on from these early life experiences of toxic vulnerability, what can't he do? What does that mean for the parts of himself that he's had to kind of split off from? And this kind of version of masculinity that he's embodying, is that actually more of a straitjacket, a set of constraints of a way that he has to be? So what do I mean by all of that? Well, James Bond is somebody who yes, has the power to be physically strong, but does he have emotional strength? If we define strength as, the ability to do something difficult or to resist force, does he have the strength to share his vulnerability with a loved one? Does he have the strength to empathise with somebody else? Does he have the strength to share sadness or sorrow? And I think, this is a very different way of looking at Bond, which I think is really powerful to do with young people, and we can get into some of the kind of outcomes of doing that.
So before we come to sort of how we might use this with young people and hear from you, Kathy, in terms of some of the ways you've been doing that, just thinking about Bond right now, Ian, because one of the things that the franchise has done successfully is sort of, to some extent, reboot, but at the same time there are still the same Bond at its kernel. Where do you think it is now in relation to sort of society as we are in 2024?
I think the question of what does it mean to be British, what is Britishness, has been so contentious and has been so brought into the public discourse with things like Brexit, with certain immigration policies. And I think it's found form or has manifest in the questions around Bond's identity. Can Bond be played by an actor of colour, let's say? Can Bond be played by a woman, let's say? And I think the degree to which people uphold the Bond mythos, the degree to which they gatekeep to a certain degree who is allowed to play that character, it's not too far of a stretch, I think, to see this as something of a sort of synonym with who's allowed to say who's British or what constitutes Britishness. And this is a question that has been really to the forefront, I think, of our cultural imagination. I'm thinking as well, particularly of the kind of the hostile policies of recent governments, and the degree to which people who have lived in this country for most of their lives were, in the Windrush scandal, for instance, sent back, for instance, to somewhere like Jamaica, where Fleming wrote his novels. I'm not as sure the contemporary films are necessarily as progressive as they might like to think they are. So we had in the most recent film, No Time to Die, we had a sort of a black female 007, which at the time a certain section of people were up in arms saying this is quote unquote too woke, a term I'm not going to mention again, but just to sort of say the degree to which the filmmakers, let's say, might have been able to have their cake and eat it. So Daniel Craig gets to play James Bond, but Lashana Lynch gets to play 007. I think it's quite an effective way to show, actually, Bond and who we think of as the icon 007 are in fact extricable in the canon universe of this film now. But I think as well, with the reboot, which has certainly been successful with Casino Royale, I'm thinking of sort of the casting and perhaps the kind of trajectory of certain other supporting characters. So we've had Naomi Harris, a very fine British actress, cast as Moneypenny. And we didn't know she was Moneypenny in Skyfall. We thought she was just Eve, another sort of sidekick. But ever since Skyfall in 2012, that character has really been relegated to desk duty and doesn't have that much to do. So she had a very strong start, but actually hasn't had much of a follow-up. I'm thinking also of Jeffrey Wright, the American actor who plays Felix Leiter, again, a black character played by an African-American actor. Felix Leiter, from the novels, Bond's longtime ally, good friend, often in scrapes together, has absolutely no discernible effect on any of the plots in the films he appears in. So he appears in Casino Royale. He effectively performs a kind of martial aid symbol when Bond kind of gets booted out of the casino game. Leiter, CIA agent, comes in and gives him the money to buy himself back into the game, on the condition that the CIA get to take in Le Chiffre as though they've done all the work. So again, it's a kind of wry way of saying, we'll provide the money, but we're not actually going to do the work. Again, in Quantum of Solace, his sort of role is reduced to kind of bureaucracy. So I don't necessarily see there being a great advancement in terms of the representation of African-American characters. And then finally, I'd say Dame Judi Dench, much lauded, well-deserved. And again, spoiler for those who have not seen Skyfall, although it's been 13 years, so I should hope that at least quite a few listeners have seen it. As I said, it is the most successful of the Bond films, financially speaking. It took over $1 billion. It was that time that coincided with the Diamond Jubilee, the Olympics. Dame Judy's character, M, Bond's boss, is killed off at the end of that film. And arguably over her tenure, an awful lot of the plots of the films, I'm thinking something like The World Is Not Enough, where her mistakes perhaps leads to almost nuclear Armageddon. And again, arguably the plot of Skyfall is entirely her fault. In terms of her treatment of Javier Bardem's character as a rogue agent. So in terms of the representation, not just of African-American actors, not just of Black British actors, but in terms of older female actors as well, I don't necessarily see the series as having been as progressive in its representation of, let's say, other demographics as it might necessarily be.
So that's who we're talking about and what we're talking about when we're talking about Bond. But Kathy, I know you've been working with Ian and with Elly thinking about how do we use Bond in conversations with young people, conversations with families. Why do you think that Bond is a good vehicle for these kind of conversations and this kind of education?
So first of all, I think it's an amazing asset within family life to be able to have dialogue about anything to do with all of the themes that have been aforementioned. But I think Bond is someone every single member of one's family will have a view about, and some sort of historic relationship with the films themselves. So I think you don't need to sort of start from the beginning with Bond. Everyone, it's something around the dinner table that you can get stuck into. And you have a sort of a pre-existing knowledge of, and everything that Ian has said about the sort of the embodiment of British values, manliness, masculinity, why do we like Bond? Why do we dislike? Is there anything we dislike about him? It's so easy to have an opening dialogue with your children about that character. Even grandparents will have views about Bond. So, for example, a friend of mine was talking about Bond around the dinner table, and the granddad said they loved Sean Connery, and the granny said that was her favourite actor as well. And then, the younger child was able to say, but, he's on YouTube talking about hitting women, as a real person, as an actor. And that obviously brings out and surfaces a lot of contradictions, a lot of, it initiated a dialogue about the commentary underneath the YouTube video that's still there. Lots of people talking about it, agreeing with Sean Connery in 2024. So there's so much material under that umbrella of Bond for family dialogue. That's so interesting because it raises the question of, it shows how Bond remains relevant. Because I remember when chatting to Elly about some of the work that you've been doing initially, my initial head was, we're always thinking about how do we ensure PSHE is kind of up to date and relevant, and the natural thing when thinking about how we're going to teach about relationships or misogyny is like, okay, well, we should be talking about the latest energy drink flogging influencer who's doing the rounds on TikTok. But from what I think from discussion we've had is it sounds like Bond not only retains a relevance, but actually, things like at the same time you've got Sean Connery on YouTube saying these things. So it's not that it's totally disconnected from young people's lives as well. That's right. I mean, there's so much pre-existing material with Bond. And I think he's fresh in the memory, even from younger generations, because of the Olympics. Everyone remembers the tea with the Queen, that scene. And I think, it's the lens through which we can initiate so many conversations about so many topics that are really, really urgent. So, in terms of, as Elly referred to earlier, that man box that is Bond sort of restrained by who we want him to be. What is attractive about him? Which when we're speaking to young people, we really have to acknowledge that. There's an attraction in many of his qualities and characteristics, but also, are his values reflective of our own, as individuals, as viewers of the film? There's so much to unpick over time.
And I think one of the other reasons why Bond is a useful vehicle for the kinds of conversations that Kathy's outlining there is because actually young people aren't too attached to him. So coming back to your point, Jono, of, the natural thought can be we need to have somebody that's really relevant right now. But actually, say, for, Andrew Tate, for example, has been a figure of impact in recent years. But actually, if you start conversations about Andrew Tate in a classroom, that's going to engender it's going to open a whole can of worms that's not necessarily helpful and potentially engender quite a lot of defensiveness from some boys who maybe have taken on board some of his messages. So the beauty of Bond is that he's of eternal kind of significance, but he's actually, young people are not that identified with him or wedded to him, which provides some freedom to look at what he's all about and whether they do want to embody some of his qualities or not.
I think the difficulty with a figure like Andrew Tate, whilst a very important figure to talk about in terms of the overt misogyny, displayed in his billions, his videos have been viewed billions of times, is as a parent, if you don't have some knowledge of him and knowledge of the content, you can just end up in a sort of a battle of words. And I think with Bond, he helpfully allows us to recognise the tension between some of the qualities in a character that are really attractive and that are appealing to us and we like to see on the screen, but also, the contradiction of caring about a character, but also not really approving of some of his attitudes and views. So Andrew Tate can be much harder to talk about and to deal with those kind of rationalizations that a young person might put forward if you don't really. Whereas with Bond, you can empathize with your child that, I find it disappointing that maybe, some of the qualities that, he exposes aren't really. Should we be clapping in the theatre to those? So I think that it's a nice kind of. Bond provides a kind of a shared platform a little bit more easily than some of the more extreme figures, I think, that are more contemporary even.
And this speaks to the power of fiction, doesn't it? That actually taking one step away from all of these real world people, and there's a playfulness and creativity and exploration in fiction. We know that through fiction we can explore the deepest truths in a way that sometimes facts can't get to.
I think coming back to this point about parents, families having a Bond having been part of people's lives for so many years, and yet looking back, most people having some kind of nagging understanding of the problematic things. I mean, in conversation with you, in questions of sort of like how many times has Bond raped someone?
Yeah. It's troublingly more than perhaps the casual viewer might think. It's at least 5 or 6 times that it's happened. And I was doing some sort of research around this just to sort of check some of the sort of stats that I think might be useful for this conversation. And there was a wonderful article on unsafe sex in the James Bond films, and where it focuses on sex education by Lara Zegers and Richard Zegers. And they provided some really interesting stats that I think, unfortunately, play out sort of some of the troubling narratives we're addressing here. Bond has had sex with 58 different women across the films. 22% of those women have, during that sexual intercourse just beforehand, have consumed alcohol to minor, moderate, large degrees. No type of contraception is ever mentioned or used. There's never, in a sort of post-coital scene, any disposal of contraceptive materials. Sexually transmitted diseases don't seem to exist in this world. You think someone who is so prolific, someone who does not use protection, someone who perhaps might have, to use the casual term, slept around a bit, that they might exist to a degree more than they do. But also perhaps maybe more troubling for where we're going to go with this, a total of 28% of the women that Bond sleeps with don't actually survive to the end of the film. So there is a very clear correlation in these narratives between the role of so-called Bond girls, Bond women, as objects of sexual desire, as objects, period, and as characters, if we may call them characters, who meet an end prematurely, often is the case, which is quite troublingly. And then just a final few, there was another article written by a team of researchers from the University of Otago in New Zealand, and they looked at the degree to which Bond consumes alcohol. And they said, if Bond were a real person, he not only does he outdo the average British male in terms of sort of sexual appetite and consumption, but his blood alcohol level would be so high it would be at a sort of non-functioning level. So this is a physical, biological impossibility represented and distilled in this character. So we've got a few things there. We've got the issues around STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, alcohol consumption, the casual disposal and treatment of women that I think will play out a little bit more in our conversation around some of the kind of more problematic elements and how we might use Bond then to redress and talk about some of these issues in a healthy and productive way.
I mean, I'm just loving this international network of Bond researchers, a sort of shadowy, spectre-like organisation with academics cat-stroking.
I'm afraid if I tell you any more, you will be subjected to some sort of pool of piranhas or some sort of electrical chair. So I'm not going to say any more about that.
I have my cyanide pill in there just behind my tongue. So Kathy, thinking about, so we've got this kind of incredibly rich material to explore so many different issues with children and young people. What's the route in? Where do we start?
I think, first of all, recognising the critical importance of engaging with our children about anything. But all of these contemporary themes, the real engine room for this dialogue is at home around that dinner table, first and foremost. I think that there has to be a diffusion of responsibility always between what's happening in school with PSHE, but also we need alignment between home and school. And for sort of parents listening, I think it's really important to just start the conversation, to ask great questions, to open up that child's thinking. What do you think about Bond? I was listening to this podcast and they were talking about his different qualities. Do you have a favourite Bond? Literally just start there and follow that yellow brick road of their thinking. But always with an eye to not end up in a battle of ideas, but to the mission is really to increase their sort of their cognitive flexibility around these ideas, to just sprinkle the conversation with, do you think this could be the case? Do you think he really is a good example of the embodiment of British values? I mean, every teenager in the world will have an opinion about that. So I think that our mission is to just bring these questions into this space and model an interest in them, model an interest in what masculinity, how it's represented. Just you don't need to be an expert or a clinical psychologist or even a criminologist to have those dialogues. It is caring about these things and caring about how things make us feel. So you might watch, a Bond film together as a family and you might say, do you know what? This was recorded 13 years ago and for some reason it doesn't feel as comfortable watching this scene. I wonder why that is. I think, and as I was saying earlier, it's the one film maybe out of a few that we would watch together with teenagers. And I think that there's huge fruitful opportunities within that to, as I said, to have those conversations that are multi-generational and really, really important.
I love that, this sort of not making this a battle of ideas, to just working to increase that cognitive flexibility, that sort of opening up ideas, which whether we're around the dinner table or in a PSHE classroom, it's not about some sort of, this is right, these are the things you should be thinking. It's about enabling that space, absolutely.
I also think there's enormous value when you hear your child critically engaging with it. that's a very precious moment where you can validate, how they're feeling and say, I really love, I agree. Yeah, I can see that this is an animating conversation for you. I can see this is really interesting to you. I really love hearing your ideas. You've made me think. So I think that there are ways to have those conversations that will actually, we want these young people to bring these conversations back into the common room, to say, well, what do you think about James Bond? Or, just literally stirring the pot and igniting those conversations will be very, very valuable.
Elly, we've heard from Ian about the kind of the role of women in Bond films and women as objects, women who do not survive. What do you think from a sort of taking this to the PSHE classroom and, thinking about a lot of the work you've done around pornography, thinking about objectification, what do you think are some of the ways that we might start to explore that sort of in a classroom dynamic?
Place that I would begin with that is gender norms, actually, and returning to this idea of James Bond being a real man. I think, following on from Kathy's approach, that's just a really interesting starting point. So let's have a discussion about that. Is he a real man? What would we want a real man to do? And Kathy, Ian and I have devised some lesson resources which we're continuing to work on. But our first lesson, is called the real man myth or idea. And we look at, within that we have activities where we look at a whole kind of range of human qualities. And then we consider which of these skills and qualities does Bond have in this table, which things can he do, which things can't he do? So, does he have the courage to jump off a, burning building? Tick. Does he have the courage to open up about his feelings? Maybe not. And, just, again, in that curious, open way, we're not coming in with a set of right answers, but it's just a very different place to begin with Bond, and gets young people thinking then about what do we mean by these words that we might fling around, like strength or courage, and also authenticity. So then flowing on from that activity, looking at what those three words mean and opening it up beyond Bond to look at examples of, say, strength, courage and authenticity in the rest of life. And hopefully leaving young people with, like Kathy said, more flexibility. And fundamentally, what I would hope is that young people have a flexibility around gender norms. Certainly not saying that gender identity is inherently harmful or that gender norms are a problem, but it's when they become very rigid and they are kind of, young people are pressured to live up to them, they require this kind of constant performance and they become this straitjacket, then we've got an issue. And so really we just kind of want to query some of the things that these rigid gender norms are saying to young people and saying, actually, is that really strength? Is that really courage? Or are there different ways of being? And I think we can have exactly the same kinds of conversation around femininity, which we often don't focus on, but arguably notions of femininity can be just as rigid as those around masculinity, and equally constraining. So, there's so much that you can kind of flow from this starting point to then explore and discuss.
And we feel that actually exploring notions of femininity, there's rich material in Bond as well.
I was going to ask Ian about sort of the concept of women being rescued by Bond. When I think about Bond films, he's always, the gun's ready. He's ready to, jump in and save that girl from a car that's been riddled with bullets, or she's the one that ducks down and he's the one, firing the bullets. And I don't know if that's the case or not. Is there sort of damsel in distress, a concept within Bond that sort of runs through those films or not?
In the films, I'd say yes, to a certain degree, certainly in the sort of 60s and 70s. Although, kind of in a cruel irony, the source material, Fleming's novels, it's really not like that at all. So the films have a huge deal of responsibility in I suppose, crystallising and kind of reifying to a certain degree our perceptions of the quote-unquote Bond girl or Bond woman. I'll give you an example. I think of a character like Honey Rider from the novel Dr. No. She is an adept swimmer. She is a sort of effectively, in all but name and without the qualification, a kind of natural scientist. She knows the landscape really well. And in fact, in an awful lot of the novels, not just Dr. No, it is the women who have access to a certain kind of context or contextual knowledge or information that Bond doesn't. And often it is the women who affect the plot to a far greater degree than Bond does. That is not carried over into the films, where they seem to present, and perhaps this is more to do with the visual medium of cinema, they seem to present women as objects to be looked at. And the quality of to be looked at-itness is more, I suppose, readily obvious in that medium than it necessarily is on the page or in the kind of literary form. So absolutely, I would say the Bond films, while they seem to lay claim each, iteration or each new film to an actress might say in a press junket, my Bond girl is not the same as any other Bond girl. She's different. And this is something that actresses have been saying, or probably have been coached by the kind of press team to say for years. So I think the Bond films have deliberately toyed with this notion of female progression, the sense that each film, as we move forward, we're moving forward in some sort of teleological trajectory of what woman is, what a strong woman is. And I think we can all agree, putting a machine gun in a woman's hands doesn't necessarily make her a strong woman. In the same way, going back to Elly's point, that jumping out of a burning building with a machine gun or not doesn't necessarily make Bond strong in the sense of what we might want to value or talk about when it comes to actual strength and what makes a man a real man.
So I've got a question which is a bit tangential, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is about this distinction between the books and the films. And do you think that plays into it as well, that there is a more deliberate presentation of femininity in this way in films because they are ultimately a different type of cultural product?
I do. I don't know if people are familiar with Laura Mulvey and her work on the male gaze, and the degree to which this was originally a kind of film studies piece, the notion that cinema, film, TV is generally filmed for and from the point of view of the heterosexual male gaze. And by gaze, I mean G-A-Z-E and not G-A-Y-S, just for clarification. This notion that the world is presented in a certain way by men for other men. And that includes everything from commercials to porn to Bond films. The very first moment Sean Connery's Bond lays eyes on Ursula Andress, who plays Honey Rider in that film, she's emerging from the swash on the island in the Caribbean. Bond is tucked under a palm tree, so he is in some sort of lurid dark shade. He is a literal voyeur. This woman does not know she's being looked at. And a sort of now dated Channel 4 countdown. Channel 4 used to do these kind of countdowns. This was named the number one sexiest moment in all of cinema, of all time up to that point. James Bond voyeuristically perving on Honey Rider coming out of the sea. This notion that this woman has not been given agency in this moment. She is something to be looked at. She's singing to herself. It's a moment of intimacy and privacy. And in the novels, in fact, she doesn't wear any swimwear. She wears a belt with a knife. And Fleming describes her first instinct is to cover her pubis, leaving her breasts exposed. So again, I said a moment ago that, yes, film is a more sort of perhaps voyeuristically medium than maybe literature. But again, in the sort of pre-popular film age Fleming perhaps was writing in, you get a sense of there being a sort of titillation on the page. This is something that is deliberate, and Fleming was very deliberate about this. His writing, he said, is designed for hot-blooded heterosexual males in trains at airports, this kind of thing, the sort of pulpy nature of it. So, absolutely, I think film plays into the nature by which women are represented, and the Bond films, of course, have a great deal of responsibility for the successive iterations of how their so-called quote unquote strong Bond girls are presented, often, unfortunately, in very detrimental ways.
So I think through all of this, really highlighting the richness of this material, both in terms of the presentation of masculinity and the presentation of femininity. I think there's obviously this real need not to simply present this form of masculinity in a way that is just going to cause defensiveness and is not going to do it in a way that's just going to kind of do down men more broadly. So when thinking about that, how best way to present Bond, and also a question of sort of, is Bond redeemable? You know, could Bond be emancipated from the trauma of his experiences?
I think in watching the last film, there was a sort of a palpable relief that he had sort of found that paternal side to himself that sort of naturally brought out that kind of the vulnerable side, if you like, or a warmer side that everybody in the cinema welcomed. And I think it opened up that dialogue. What have we been missing? Oh, this character's finally been able to let his hair down a little bit and be who he wants to be. And that child was sort of fatherhood was the sort of the redemption. That was what it felt like as a viewer. And I think I remember everybody sighing in the cinema that there was some kind of relief for everyone. That he didn't have to keep up the stiff upper lip, that this child had brought something out in him, that he'd found this connection, you know, that felt good but shocking even to himself. That was my impression of it. And I think that last film allows us to, you know, remind our boys, you know, my children, I've got 2 teenage boys, that that sort of emotional redemption or vulnerability is an exciting space to be in. And it offers the opportunity for connection and relationship. Whereas before he seemed quite someone who, just as Ian referred to earlier, was just moving through relationships, that there is opportunity through vulnerability to find the courage. He needed to find courage at the end, didn't he, I think, to be able to, ignite this new amazing relationship that had so much potential wrapped into it, basically.
I think one of the shameful things, perhaps, about the film that Kathy's referring to, No Time to Die, where Bond does die at the end, it's just as he reaches this sort of moment of apotheosis, the realisation that there's more to life than himself, that he has fathered a child, he is in love with that child's mother. Léa Seydoux is the first actress to have really had a major role across more than one film, because more often than not in the Bond films, we reach the closing credits and we never see that sexual partner, Bond's sexual partner, ever again. I think it is a shame that actually, clearly, even in the worldview of the film, in the ideology of the film, there doesn't seem to be a way to reconcile Bond's emotional maturity or path to emotional maturity with Bond's lifestyle itself, i.e., the only way in which the film can end is with Bond's death. Now, on the one hand, we could say, that's him. He's fulfilled his life purpose. He's realised, actually, there's more to it than, bedding women and shooting bad guys. He's left something on this earth beyond himself. However, we don't see that emotional work being done. And I wonder if, to link back to what we're talking about, emotional maturity, taking the steps, the effort to address, maybe redress some issues around problematic masculinities, that's hard work. We don't see that modelled at the end of that film. There are moments that we can pick out from the Bond films. I mean, the classic example Elly and Kathy and I always talk about is Inspector, where Monica Bellucci's character is crying as Bond is kissing her. We want our young men and our young women to be emotionally cognizant of what's in front of them. If you are engaging with your partner romantically and you see that they're crying, do you, like Bond, keep going in your pursuit of romantic conquest? Or do you stop and engage and ask the questions? So to a certain degree, I agree with Kathy that this does show a kind of emotional apotheosis in Bond. But to another degree, I don't think, and I think this is more about the confines of the film and the genre itself of those films, we are not treated to seeing how that, reaches its full potential.
Yes, and I think that works beautifully in conversations with young people, doesn't it? Because in a way we're saying, Bond gets so far, so how can you go beyond Bond? In a way, more than Bond, how can you be more than who Bond is? How can you, develop that skill set where you can connect with another human, where you can take responsibility and have commitments. And as you were saying, Jono, it's not that we are judging all of what bond is or epitomises. It's not either or. We want young people, my vision, my ambition is that boys and girls, all genders, have a freedom around their identity. And, being masculine or feminine or whatever it is, doesn't close off parts of themselves, doesn't close off skills. So be the person that has the courage to jump out of a burning building, but also be the person that has the courage to ask your friend how they're feeling, or can it deal with those difficult emotions that they're holding themselves, or whatever it may be.
So don't allow these narratives about gender or anything else to constrain, to be a set of straitjackets which are going to stop you from being who you want to be.
Exactly. And similarly with women, yes, be into your appearance and makeup and beauty, but that's not all of who you are, and that's not where your core self-worth lies.
It's been an incredibly rich and nuanced conversation about bond, and it's not about doing bond down. It's about recognizing, we have this extraordinary and unique kind of cultural product through which we can explore a whole range of different things. Because Ian, you've talked about some of the responses you've had from people when you've talked about bond, very passionate responses from the sounds of it.
I have. There is an awful lot of people's emotional investment. Their identity is invested in the notion of Bond as a character, purely, I imagine, because of the longevity of that character and that genre. It's been around for the best part of 70 years, right? And I'm often asked to comment about sort of matters relating to Bond in different sort of print, digital media, and I will often receive a bit of spam for certain people who don't like what I've said, or who think that by questioning maybe some of the things that we've been questioning here today about Bond, that I am in some ways disloyal, or that I am disloyal to my gender, my sex, that I'm disloyal to this sort of icon of masculinity, but perhaps this icon of Britishness. I'm not British. So there's this really interesting challenge, and I've received some fantastically worded hate mail over the years, which I won't read out here for fear of offending. I'm presuming this person is listening. They probably have no idea. But people do really vehemently object to challenging Bond. And I suppose it's just to re-emphasize the point that you made. It's yes, we can challenge, softly or otherwise, the ideologies of certain favoured or long-held or dear icons of our culture. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to revert to hating them. I mean, I would say I'm a big Bond fan, as much as I think there is a lot of material there to mine for discussion and for us to talk about and engage with. It doesn't affect the fact that I will go and line up and see the next film. But I do think, and this is sort of my sort of larger remit in what I do at work, it's about challenging those kind of cultural narratives we have around us. Yes, it's fine to enjoy something, but are there particular political, ideological, sociological reasons why perhaps we enjoy them? Have we challenged those enough? And I think this is what we're getting at with this project. The question of masculinity, femininity have too long been left uncommented upon. And I suppose what we're doing here is a sort of small part to kind of contribute to questioning those and not just assuming a kind of an essential value when it comes to either quote-unquote men or quote-unquote women, that these things need to be and should be challenged in a productive way.
A wonderful place to wrap up. But before we do, I think just Elly, if you want people to take one or two things from this conversation and something perhaps they could take back into their homes, into their classroom, what would you want people to say?
I think there's a broad point about fiction, that through fiction we can explore truths in a way that facts can be tricky to get to. So, linking with what Kathy was saying earlier, I want to just empower listeners to just think about the fiction that they've enjoyed or not enjoyed, and who are the characters in those stories, and how might they provide jumping off points for conversations and discussions and debates about gender, emotion? Fundamentally, what does it mean to be human, and what do we want it to mean?
I think, again, parents don't need to wait for even PSHE lessons. Anything they see on the news. The other day there was a debate about who Juliet could be in Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's endless. So I think that using everyday moments from the news, things you're reading about, asking your child their opinion around that dinner table, there's quite a lot of evidence that those mealtime conversations are not just brilliant for children's mental health, but they're brilliant for developing their thinking and their oracy. It's all good. And all we're doing today is sort of reminding everyone of the importance of family talk. But particularly on some of these bigger themes, that we can actually approach them in ways that feel okay as parents and maybe non-experts, if you like.
Thank you. Well, I think for all of the nuance and thought that's gone into this conversation, there is obviously actually only one question that anyone really cares about. And I'm going to come to you, Ian, for that. It says, who is the next Bond going to be?
It's an exclusive reveal, Jono. I can in fact tell you and your listeners, it's me. I'm the next James Bond.
Hooray.
No.
Is that the first Irish James Bond?
No, Pierce Brosnan.
Oh.
Good Navan man, Kathy.
Cut that out.
So, there's a lot of speculation around this. A lot of names have been... Richard Madden, I think his profile raised quite a bit after Bodyguard, the BBC series Bodyguard, where he played Keeley Hawes' bodyguard. James Norton, I think as well. He's done a kind of lot of period drama, and if you look back at the kind of history of someone like Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, there seems to be a kind of a heritage of in their pre-Bond days, a new Bond actor will usually have done quite a bit of sort of period drama, and, you know, obviously need to look good in a suit, that kind of thing. For my money, it's on Jamie Bell, who listeners might remember from Billy Elliot. He is about the right age that Daniel Craig was when he took on the mantle. He's recently worked with Barbara Broccoli, who produces the Bond films on Film Stars Don't Die in Liverpool with Annette Bening. And he strikes me as someone who has the reasonably low-ish enough profile that the Bond role usually, drives into the stratosphere, but is also a really good actor. You know, a lot of people say, what about so-and-so? What about so-and-so? And my instinct is always, I mean, okay, Henry Cavill looks good in a suit, but I don't think he's a great actor. Sorry, Henry. And he's already been claimed by Superman and whatnot. So there's this sense as well that actually, while Roger Moore in the 70s and the 80s could sort of lift the eyebrow and do very little, Daniel Craig has brought a level of acting chops to this that I don't think any of the other actors, in my humble opinion, can, lay a torch to. So I think the next person to take on Bond is going to have to be a really good actor as well, because I think they have raised the game in terms of what the Bond narratives are and can be.
Fantastic. Well, you heard it here first, Jamie Bell. Although I have to say, listeners will have missed an excellent eyebrow raise from Ian, so I wouldn't rule yourself out of the running just yet.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for what has been a fabulous conversation, and we will have to wait and see whether Ian is right. But in the meantime, thank you, Kathy, thank you, Ian, thank you, Ellie. Look out for resources which will be coming on using James Bond in the classroom, using James Bond in conversations, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Tomorrow is the Question is a podcast from Fully Human and the PSHE Association, presented by me, Jono Baggaley, with music and sound editing by Nathaniel Pern and production support from Sam Harvey.